Hey, this is Anney.
And Samantha.
And welcome to Stuff I Never Told You, a production of iHeartRadio.
And welcome to another Feminist Around the World. And today we are jumping into the world of medical sciences. And we want to talk about scientist, geneticist, and professor Dr. Marlena Fejzo. So now Dr. Fejzo has been making headlines in the last couple of years for her discovery after years of research. And just this year, she was selected as one of the Time Women of the Year. So it is 2024. August of 2024 to be specific. So just for that timestamp, because who knows, you may be listening 3 years down the road.
Could be.
Anyway, so what did Dr. Fejzo work so hard to discover? Well, she discovered the cause of morning sickness that so often plague pregnant people. Her discovery, which hardly anyone wanted to help with in the beginning, is one that could actually help those who oftentimes are so affected by it that they become unable to do everyday tasks. If you've been pregnant, I know you know what I mean. There's some people who are like, no, it wasn't a big deal. And there's some people who are like, nah, I'm bedridden. Like, I'm in so much pain. I couldn't imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So Dr. Fejzo herself had struggled through some intense. And I feel like saying morning sickness is not enough, pregnancy sickness, but like that still feels like it undermines it. Just the overall ailments, I guess, that would often disrupt her life.
In an article written for the University of Southern California, they talk about Dr. Fejzo's work and recognitions. Here's a quote about it, quote, "Up to 80% of pregnant women experience morning sickness, more accurately known as pregnancy sickness, since it can occur at any time of day. Another 2% are affected by a severe form called hyperemesis gravidarum, or HG, which can cause dehydration, weight loss, electrolyte imbalances, and hospitalization." Dr. Fejzo's persistence in understanding HG and her exceptional research has advanced our understanding of the biology of HG, which is information that will be used to improve health outcomes for both mothers at risk and their children, said Christopher Hyman, director of the Center for Genetic Epidemiology at the Keck School of Medicine of USC.
Right. And in the Times article that featured Dr. Fejzo as one of the Women of the Year, they detailed Dr. Fejzo's own experience that helped lead her to her discovery. Quote, geneticist Marlena Fejzo had a difficult start to her first pregnancy. She suffered from nausea and vomiting, as roughly 70% of pregnant people do, but pushed through until the symptoms lessened with time. Her second pregnancy in 1999 was another story. For weeks, all Fejzo could do was lie flat on her back, since even rolling on her side triggered debilitating nausea. Eating or drinking was out of the question, forcing her to get a home IV for nourishment. Every second, she says, was torture. Fejzo, who is now 56 and a clinical assistant professor at the University of Southern California's Keck School of Medicine, had something more serious than typical morning sickness. She was ultimately diagnosed with hyperemesis gravidarum, HG, a condition that leads to extreme nausea and vomiting in 1% to 3% of pregnancies.
And the article continues, haunted by her doctor's dismissal and the limits of his care, Fejzo tried to learn whatever she could about HG while she recovered. That turned out to be not much at all. The condition was barely studied at the time. There was so little known, Fejzo says, but she had a hunch there was something biological going on. She vowed to be the one to find out what it was, both for her own sake and that of her future children, twin daughters who were later born via surrogate. "I didn't want my daughters to have to go through that," she says, "or anybody else." And she knew that this was something that hasn't been thoroughly looked at. In fact, according to a New York Times article she was featured in, she talked about how little information there was. Quote, "Nothing was known," she said. "There was so little research. Hyperemesis has long been under-researched and insufficiently recognized, in part because about 70% of pregnancies come with some degree of nausea and vomiting, which is usually not dangerous," Dr. Tovik said. "Healthcare providers can be slow to differentiate between the more common morning sickness and the rarer but more severe hyperemesis, and to offer treatment, including medications and nutrition," she said.
Yeah, disturbingly, with the little information about hyperemesis, doctors would blame women for the cause. And here's more from the Times article. Over the last century, physicians have claimed without evidence that hyperemesis is a subconscious attempt at oral abortion as if trying to throw up a pregnancy, a rejection of femininity, a product of sexual frigidity, a strategy of taking a time out from stressful household responsibilities, or a bid for attention, as Dr. Fejzo's doctor had told her, which... yeah. As a result, women have often been blamed and punished for their own illnesses. In the 1930s, hospitalized hyperemesis patients were denied the solace of the vomit bowl and forced to lie in their own vomit. So to this day, patients hospitalized with the condition are sometimes isolated in a dark room and prohibited from having visitors or access to their cell phones. This treatment has been based in part on the theory that hyperemesis is caused by a woman's subconscious rejection of pregnancy, and the isolation would make her accept it, said Dr. Felipe Deruel, a professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Strasbourg, via email.
And being an expert already working in women's health, which included her doing research in breast cancer and in fibroids, she started focusing on the root cause of her own experiences. The article continues about her research efforts, quote, unable to find a mentor interested in hyperemesis, Dr. Fejzo took a job studying ovarian cancer at the university, a position she stayed in mostly part-time for 20 years. But she began piecing together research on hyperemesis during her evenings and weekends and on Fridays when she wasn't working in the lab. Her younger brother, Rick Schoenberg, 51, a statistician at UCLA, helped her create an online survey of hyperemesis patients, and the Hyperemesis Education and Research, HER, Foundation, offered collaborators and small grants to fund her work. In 2005, Dr. Fejzo also began partnering with obstetrician gynecologist at the University of Southern California.
Right. And though she was able to finally get samples for her tests, she wasn't able to get the funding she needed for the research. But she was able to do so when she took a 23andMe DNA test. Here's some more from her feature in the Times article. Then in 2010, she took a 23andMe DNA test that changed everything. When Fejzo saw the survey 23andMe sends to its customers to learn more about how their genes relate to their health, it sparked an idea. She persuaded the company to include questions about HG in its survey, and by 2016, she had access to genetic data and survey responses from about 50,000 people. By analyzing that trove of data, Fejzo was able to zero in on two genes of interest. One in particular seemed promising. It codes for the hormone GDF15, which is linked to appetite suppression and vomiting, and which the body produces in earnest during a pregnancy. In 2018, she published a paper in Nature Communications suggesting that a variant of that gene could predispose people to HG. She later bolstered that finding, discovering a rare genetic mutation that seemed to be even more strongly linked to developing HG.
She soon would go on to be able to publish her findings, giving those who suffer these intense levels of pain and distress an option for possible treatment and preventative measures. Again, from the Times article, quote, last year, more than 2 decades after her harrowing experience with HG, Fejzo had another breakthrough. In a paper published in Nature, she reported that people with HG tend to have high blood levels of GDF15 during pregnancy, yet produce lower than average amounts of GDF15 prior to pregnancy. When GDF15 levels naturally rise after conception, the shock to the system results in HG's relentless nausea and vomiting. That finding opens up promising avenues for treatment. Doctors could lower GDF15 levels during pregnancy, or if they could gradually supplement levels of the hormone in people who are not yet pregnant but deemed high risk based on personal or family history of HG, they could feasibly smooth the transition and avoid debilitating symptoms. Fejzo is now applying for funding for a clinical trial to test whether the drug metformin, which is approved to treat type 2 diabetes but is used off-label for numerous purposes and has been shown to raise GDF15 levels, works as a preventative therapy.
Right. I think a big question will be whether or not anyone will fund it, whether or not the government will see that as a need. Because as we already know, when it comes to pregnant people in the U.S. and everywhere else, they are not really taken care of and are expected just to suck it up. Like, I'm just even thinking about how, and I guess we should probably do this as a whole episode, but like how they glamorize and romanticize morning sicknesses. And they really don't tell you what this is. And yeah, if I have talked to people who talked about being in so much pain in different ways that they didn't realize was going to be a part of the pain. And then things like this about nausea and sicknesses, they just literally think, eat a saltine cracker.
Yeah.
That's the solution. And I could not imagine. There's so many reasons why I'm like, this is also why I don't want to be pregnant, because they don't take care of you and they don't care and they blame you. Anyway, she has just recently been recruited by the Materna Biosciences as chief scientific advisor to help develop a GDF-15 based treatment for HG, which is going to be ongoing for a while. And hopefully it won't be capped anytime soon, because definitely need that. And again, her own experience and her own story talks about why she's like, I'm not getting pregnant again. No way in hell. And I think there's so many people who experience that, as well as the fact that they talk about the high suicide rate, high morbidity rate that happens within pregnancy people in general. So this could be a conversation about having pregnant people being comfortable and why that should be a standard. Like this whole level of like, is a sin thing. This is that whole religious aspect, and women need to suffer in order to have being blessed with a child. Seems like such nonsense. But anyway, with works like what Dr. Fejzo has been doing and continues to do, I think it's amazing. And I hope that we get more information like this.
Yes, absolutely. It's so needed. And it's so sad that so many things like this were like, wow, only now somebody taking like, finally, you know what? People shouldn't just have to deal with this.
Right.
This shouldn't be a thing.
It shouldn't be a thing.
This shouldn't be a thing. We should look into this. Well, we are glad that Dr. Fejzo is looking into it. I'm sure we'll return and discuss that more in depth, because there is a lot to talk about there. But in the meantime, listeners, if you have any thoughts about this, any resources, if you have any suggestions on who we should talk about next, you can let us know. You can email us at stuffmediamomstuff@iheartmedia.com. You can find us on Twitter at momstuffpodcast, or on Instagram and TikTok at Stuff Mom Never Told You. We're also on YouTube. We have a TeePublic store, and we have a book you can get wherever you get your books. Thanks as always to our super producer Christina, our executive producer Maya, and our contributor Joey.
Thank you.
And thanks to you for listening. Stuff I Never Told You is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, you can check out the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.